Welcome back to Mark Holbit's vlog, everyone. Thanks for joining in. And what do we have back here? It's basically the Porsche 911. We have the 996. A lot of you who've been following the channel know that we bought this a while back. And I just want to talk about some of the things that I found out that you can find with problem areas with these vehicles. The 996 isn't necessarily flawless. There are issues that can creep up. There's a few little issues that we've got on our car. But more importantly, if you've been shopping for a 996, 911, and I do talk about what great value they are, and I still believe that is the case. In fact, there are some problem areas, and I want to talk about specific to some of the real problem, some of the problem areas that you would anticipate or you should anticipate and maybe inspect if you're taking out one of these for a test drive, or you maybe thinking of buying one. You want to do a pre-purchase inspection, of course, is important. But specifically, let's just give you the rundown. I'm going to get right to the chase here. And what are some of the key problem areas you would anticipate in a 996 Porsche 911 like this? Let's just get right to it, everyone. Because again, it's fun driving these great cars, but you just got to know what you're getting into. So let's really dive right in. So let's take this from the top. Let's go. So looking at the Porsche 911, they're great. I mean, it's a wear item. I mean, these cars are often driven very, very hard. A lot of people take them to the autocross or the racetrack. So there's some areas that you would expect premature wear. And it's not uncommon to actually have to fit brakes. I mean, you definitely want to check out the brakes. They're cross-rolled ventilated. Not that brakes wear out any worse than any other cars. What you can have is premature wheel bearing problems. Wheel bearings are some of the issues you'll find with these. They start to squeak and howl, and it's actually quite common with a lot of these 996 generations, even more so than your garden variety vehicles. So keep an eye out for wheel bearing issues. One issue as well I want to show you that you will find. See, when you pull this, because this is a frameless window, as I pull the window or the door, you'll notice it drops just a hair like that. You'll see? Try that again. Pull the door handle and it drops, and then you open that up and Bob's your uncle. Well, sometimes they don't drop, and if they don't drop, that often means that there's a plethora of issues. Now there's a couple of micro switches tucked in here, and what that does is when you pull on the lever, the mechanism actually in there does create that window to drop, because if that window doesn't drop, it can bind up in here and grab and potentially shatter a window. So obviously that has to work. That's why that system operates the way it does. And if it's not working, I would start looking by the micro switches in the door. Possibly window regulator is another issue. That's very, very common. Micro switches galore. Lots of micro switch issues with some of these earlier generation 996s. So anticipate the worst, and often these dropping windows are a problem. Same with convertible roof issues, micro switches. You can anticipate some trouble areas in that. Another problem you would expect. Let's go in here. Pop that open. Now we're gonna check out the rear trunk space here. And it's a little dirty. I haven't yet to do a full proper detail on there, so disregard that. But basically, what you could expect are some issues here. I mean, you look in here, there's a series of hoses and knobs and, all kinds of different fittings and materials and things. So where do you start and where do you end? Well, one of the common areas is this right here. This here is the expansion tank for your coolant. And that's basically where your extra coolant basically overflows. And so if you have a low level of coolant, or essentially not enough, then what that can mean is basically your engine can overheat. And if your engine overheats, it can cause a series of real catastrophic issues. So clearly you want to always make sure you have coolant in that overflow reservoir, that expansion tank, because that is a common issue. If you have a problem with that cracked leaking, you could wind up with coolant leaking out the bottom down there, and you'll see often it down by the exhaust system down there behind that rear driver side wheel. If this tank is leaking, if it's leaking, that's bad. Not just because it's the tank that's leaking, but it could mean you run out of fluid level, and then that's where things get really serious. So let's just talk about that. If, in fact, you run out of coolant, that's one of the common areas is the engine. So the liners, their cylinders can crack, break, deteriorate. Could actually mean a partial engine rebuild, because what ends up happening, it gets too hot, it overheats. And yeah, any car that overheats can suffer some catastrophic failure, but this is actually a well-documented, well-known issue of that crappy little expansion tank that can actually lead to a significant expense, and it's common. So don't neglect that. Make sure there's coolant in there and you're good to go. Another issue is the engine specifically. Of course, what are we looking at here? This is a 3.4 liter flat six, and basically the later generations are a 3.6 liter. Once you hit 2002 and above, or 2003 and above, sorry, you're basically into a 3.6. But that's not the issue. The 3.4 isn't necessarily an outlandishly unreliable engine. As a matter of fact, it's quite, well, if I can say bulletproof. But the problem is there's a couple issues within that engine. So we're looking at the back end of the engine right here. This here, but you'll notice the pulleys at the front end. Well, if the pulleys at the front, at the back end, to your drive wheels, to the transmission or your transaxle right there, you have a seal on the output of that engine going to the gearbox, and that's basically your rear main seal. Close that up. And the rear main seal is a common issue. If the rear main seal dries up, because a lot of them do, because a lot of these cars sit, people don't use them like they should be used. These are 911s, they're great. Use them, drive them, enjoy them. But a lot of people sit them too much and treat them like garage queens, and then that rear main seal leaks. So then what that means is you wind up with an oil leak somewhere at that end of the engine, and you'll find it way up kind of around below between the sets of wheels, essentially. Basically where the engine and the gearbox match up, that's essentially in the clutch area. You'll wind up with oil leaking down. That's your rear main seal. Very common problem with a lot of these vehicles. So definitely keep an eye out for those oil leaks at the front of the engine, well, I'll say at the back of the engine, but further towards the front of the car. So keep an eye out for that. That's a common issue. And before we move on to one of the biggest, ugliest common problems you'll find with a 996 like this, is let's go inside first. Take a look at some of the nickel and dime issues. So open that up and we'll look in here. So you'll see there's lots of little buttons and knobs. You got electrics here, and you got a series of electronic controls down there. You have your HVAC controls. You have all these little buttons here. You have the roof control. You have a defrost. And of course, you have your locking system there. Look over here and you have other controls and knobs and buttons depending on the amount of options you have. Of course, down here we have your power windows, rear windows, and front windows right there. So there's lots of options and features and electrics like every modern day vehicle these days. And again, this generation is particularly bad for electrics. There's poor micro switches, bad electrics, and it's not uncommon to have some nickel and dime electric switch or problem or relay. So definitely what I would suggest, if you're going to buy one of these, go through every control. Please don't skip that. Don't think, it's working, it's fine. I've heard of issues with even the horn not functioning, and I'll show you that actually before we get to this. Let's look. Pop this open. Now I've heard of cases where a horn actually works when the vehicle's parked like this and the ignition's turned off. But I've heard of people, they put the key in the ignition, turn it on, and the car's idling and running, but now all of a sudden the horn doesn't work. Even if you press it really, really hard, it just doesn't work. Well, what's going on with that? Well, there's a bunch of wiring, and some people say it has to do with some wiring in the actual steering column. And when the car's turned off, it still bridges power from somewhere else through a back door, through the wiring scheme. And that answers the question why it'll work when the car is off, but it may not work when the car is running, because then it goes through the normal route, typically through your ignition switch, to illuminate all the controls in your actual steering wheel. And so that's one of the key areas. Make sure, check your horn when the car is off, when the car is on. Check all your electrics, your buttons, your lights, your switches. Check every single button and knob. And sometimes you'll find that there's some issues along the way. Because remember, it's a Porsche, and there's nothing cheap about driving a Porsche. You think, a little switch or a light doesn't work. When you really dig in, a lot of times it's more than just a switch or a light, and it ends up being some module or some really expensive repair, or very labor intensive to repair as well. So that's one thing that I've learned about some of these Generation 911s. Some of the electrics aren't necessarily the most robust, so be sure to go through it from top to bottom, left to right. Sunroof, make sure it's opening and closing smoothly and quietly. This is a convertible roof. Definitely make sure the roof is working well, up and down, no big noises, no big shakes and rattles, and it does it consistently a few times. Then that's going to help you build some confidence that you've got yourself a solid car. And so I can't ignore the last big one. There's a big problem that a lot of these cars have. The 996, the intermediate shaft bearing problems. Now, the intermediate shaft, they said back in 97 to about 99, there was an issue with the seals drying up. Now, the intermediate shaft is a shaft that basically connects the drive, the crankshaft, output, runs through to the camshaft, and then there's a bearing that it runs through, and that bearing is essentially like a ball bearing, okay? Like a lot of bearings you'll find almost like a glorified wheel bearing. But what it essentially, the problem with that is totally redesigned. The older 911s had a different type of bearing configuration. They still had an intermediate shaft, but a different configuration. Now in this next generation, the M96, they came up with this ball bearing design. It was a sealed bearing, and realistically, if that bearing dried up, basically you'd have yourself a catastrophic failure, because that bearing would seize up. You'd wind up with all this particulate within the engine, and it usually meant that you had to strip the engine completely down its entirety, clean it out, basically remove all the debris, run oil through it, clean it, freshen it up, put all the new parts back together, and replace the collateral damage. Or a lot of people would just drop a whole brand new engine in, just because it often saves a lot of time. But regardless, it ends up costing money out of your pocket just to get that, unfortunately, the intermediate shaft, which is like a $20 bearing. Realistically, it's not a pricey bearing to get that fixed. And sadly enough, it can cause you a lot of collateral damage and a lot of potential heartache. So definitely want to keep an eye on that. And that's one of the big issues. Now, unfortunately, the IMS bearing, of course, in 2001 roughly to 2005, they revised it, or about 2000 to 2005, they revised it. They said they upgraded it, and it was actually, they claimed it to be better. But in actuality, what they were finding was they actually had almost suffered even more failures. So it really wasn't until after 2005 that they had a better factory provided bearing. So if you bought, say, a 2007 or 2008 911, you probably had yourself a 911 with that generation of engine, and you're into the 997 car as well, and you probably had yourself a situation where you had something a little more reliable. Not perfect, but more reliable. And other than that, the only other way to get around that was upgrades that you can provide. You can get yourself an oil fed system, which provides oiling through the bearing at all times. It takes oil from the system, flushes it through, keeps oil in there, or the upgraded, essentially a ceramic type bearing that you can get from a lot of aftermarket providers. So I hope that helps everybody. You know what? Remember, life is too short to drive boring cars. And you know, every fun car always has some little glitch, some little gremlin. You name me a car that really doesn't have something that maybe you have to deal with. This Porsche 911 is no different. There are some issues you got to contend with, but I want to bring to light, in case you've been shopping for 996, there's some key areas you should be aware of. Other than that, some good old-fashioned maintenance should keep the car in tip-top shape. Love to hear from all of you whether this car seems like it's too much trouble or whether it's just a great option. So love to hear from you. Do drop a line, as well as subscribe to the channel. Remember, life's too short to drive boring cars.